And so we have these kind of a dichotomy that's set up. We have the Old versus the New, the Old Testament versus the New Testament in the broadest sense, the law of Moses versus the law of Christ, the the people of Israel versus the people of the church, or Gentile Christianity, if you want to label it that way. And so these are, or we have Old Testament versus New Testament, Old Covenant versus New Covenant. So these are discussions that happen when you kind of have a dialogue with people about, well, what do you think about the Old Testament on a kind of a general, generic kind of basis, garden variety Christian, if you will. And so this discussion that I'm having here about Matthew finds its home in the replacement theology camp, because in the parables that were left for us by the Master, by Yeshua, if you'll notice, he answers the question as to why his disciples don't fast with an immediate, well, the wedding guests are going to rejoice when the bridegroom's here. And, someday the bridegroom is going to leave. And when that happens, then when he's taken away, then they can fast. But for now, since he's here, and I'm him, by the way, this is Yeshua speaking, well, then fasting is the wrong approach, right? You don't want to mourn and fast at a wedding. It's just not common sense. It doesn't make any good sense. And so he follows that answer up with these two parables that are kind of enigmatic, because he doesn't give us any, interpretation, immediate interpretation, like he does with other parables. Sometimes he'll say the kingdom of heaven is like thus and such, and then he'll say to his disciples, you know what, you don't understand it? Let me explain it to you, and then blah, blah, blah. He'll lay it out. But he doesn't do that this time. And so what historic Christianity has done is they have supplied an interpretation, kind of an analogy or a homily, or some type of interpretation, and it amounts to this idea that Jesus is actually bringing something so radically new that it is actually incompatible with the old. So let me stop and let that sink in, right? That's the kind of historic, overarching Christian perspective, is Jesus teaching his radical new way of living is diametrically different and opposed to the old way of living and approaching God. And so we have this idea of, do we approach God by keeping the commandments and keeping the law of Moses, or do we now approach God by walking in love and by grace and forgiveness in the way of the cross and things like that? That's why we have this old versus new dichotomy set up, using this passage and the interpretations of the parables as our impetus. So that's why we're having this discussion. As you know, I disagree with that interpretation. I think we should have even just left it at the common sense factor. Why are you guys not fasting? Well, because it's a wedding. Why would you fast? And then Yeshua kind of, bang with two more common sense examples. You want to put a piece of cloth back together, or clothing that you like, you want to patch that thing up, use some common sense when you're patching it. Otherwise, you're going to have a mess. Same thing is true with putting wine into wineskins. You want to transfer new wine into wineskins, you've got to do some thinking first and planning. Otherwise, you're going to have a mess on your hands. So common sense can be applied to the entire section, the entire answer plus the parables. We don't even have to go into this idea of replacement theology. We don't even have to add that interpretation. But historic Christianity has done that. There are other other interpretations, and that's what we're going to now turn and look at some of those. So let me pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago. In my own commentary, which is available on my website at tetzetorah.com, I said, and we just looked at Tim Hagg's commentary. Tim Hagg's a Messianic Jewish author. He writes from a pro-Torah perspective. He's going to take a perspective that I highly appreciate and agree with, because it's going to say, well, it doesn't really fit with the rest of the Bible if we teach that Jesus came to do away with the law. It doesn't fit with the prophecies that God gave to Israel of old about how that one day he would fill them with his spirit and cause them to walk into his ways, right? It doesn't fit with the lifestyle that we know Jesus to have led, or even the Apostle Paul to have led, right? They were both Torah-observant Jewish men. So we read through Tim Hagg's commentary, and here's the conclusion to what I said there. I said, in my personal opinion, Hagg's remarks are so completely self-explanatory that I need little or no supporting commentary of my own to elaborate his thoughts to you. Instead, I will simply jump to the summary and conclusions of my own commentary. So now we're ready for summary. So let's look at my own commentary and pick up my reading. Here's what I have to say. In our opening few paragraphs, we started by defining replacement theology, which is the notion that the church has replaced Israel as the viable and ongoing people of God, and concluded that it is seriously lacking in its biblical accuracy. So we're talking about replacement theology, and I go on to say that it's lacking because it's based on the fact that ancient prophecy as well as later scriptures clearly portray the ongoing relationship that God has with historic Israel, right? And I give you one example from Romans 11, 25 through 26.